The bank's auctioneer had already run through the property twice with no bids when 34-year-old Nora Alvarez raised her hand at a Sonoma County courthouse steps foreclosure sale in March, offering $40,000 for 18 acres of old vine Zinfandel that had just cost its previous owner everything he had. The Del Carmen Vineyard had been a name people in that valley recognized, not for its wine, which had never been particularly well marketed, but for the spectacular financial collapse of the man who'd run it. Marcus Doyle had leveraged the property twice to fund an expansion into a tasting room and event space that never turned a profit, missed 3 years of payments trying to keep the whole operation afloat, and finally lost it all to the bank the previous winter. By the time it reached the courthouse steps, most of the wine industry professionals in that county had already decided the whole property was a cautionary tale rather than an opportunity. Grant Whitfield, who owned a mid-sized, successful winery at 2 properties over, was there that morning mostly out of curiosity, and he laughed when Nora's hand went up. "You know Doyle ran that place into the ground," he said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear. "Whole operation was a financial disaster front to back. You're buying a headache with a view." "I appreciate the concern, Grant," Nora said, and kept her hand raised. Nobody bid against her. By that afternoon, she held the deed to 18 acres nobody else in that valley wanted for a fraction of what comparable vineyard land typically sold for. Nora was an agronomist by training, having spent 9 years working soil health consulting for vineyards across 3 counties before deciding to gamble what savings she had on land of her own rather than keep advising other people's. She'd walked the Del Carmen property twice before the auction, both times alone, both times paying almost no attention to the abandoned tasting room or the weeds choking the parking area that had clearly driven away whatever wine tourist traffic Doyle had once hoped for. She'd spent her time instead in the actual vine rows, kneeling in the dirt, examining root crowns, checking trunk diameter, reading the vines themselves rather than the business that had failed around them. What she found there told a story completely different from the one the whole county had already decided on. The vines were old, some pushing 80 years, planted long before modern irrigation systems made dry farming optional rather than necessary. Dry-farmed old vines like that, properly maintained, produced grapes of genuinely exceptional concentration and character, exactly the kind of fruit high-end winemakers actively sought out and paid premium prices for. Doyle's financial mismanagement had bankrupted his business. It had never once touched the actual asset growing in the ground. Have you ever watched everyone around you judge something by its failure in one specific area while missing entirely that the actual core of it was never the problem at all? She found the vineyard's last remaining worker, a man named Hector Reyes, 61, still living in the small caretaker's cottage on the property because nobody from the bank had gotten around to telling him to leave. He'd worked those exact rows for 22 years through 3 different owners and kept tending the vines through the entire foreclosure process on his own time, unpaid the last 4 months, because, as he told Nora plainly the first week she owned the place, somebody had to, or none of this would have been worth anything by the time it sold. "You kept working for free," Nora said. "Vines don't care whose name is on the deed. They just need somebody who understands what they actually need." Doyle stopped listening to that a long time before the bank ever came for him. Hector became, in every practical sense, Nora's real education in that first season. Walking the rows with her, explaining decades of decisions made about specific blocks, which sections had always produced the best fruit and why, where drainage ran naturally versus where it needed real attention. Small details about the property's actual character that existed nowhere in any bank paperwork or county record. It's worth understanding what actually separated Del Carmen's vines from the collapsed business built around them. A vineyard's business can fail for reasons that have nothing to do with the vines themselves. Poor debt structure, bad marketing decisions, an owner who overexpanded into ventures the land was never meant to support. The vines, meanwhile, are a separate physical asset that either receives proper agricultural care or doesn't, regardless of what's happening in the owner's bank account. Old vine dry-farmed Zinfandel specifically carries real market value precisely because it can't be quickly replicated. A new vineyard can be planted in a season, Root systems 80 years deep, forced by necessity to develop the kind of resilience and mineral complexity that shows up directly in the fruit, take generations to exist at all. Nora understood, walking those rows with Hector that spring, that she hadn't purchased a failed business. She'd purchased one of the most genuinely valuable physical assets in the county, sold at foreclosure prices because nobody bidding that morning had bothered separating the failure from the asset. She spent that first year doing almost nothing dramatic, simply proper disciplined viticulture, working alongside Hector to bring the neglected sections back into full production, letting the abandoned tasting room sit closed rather than pouring money into a venture that had already failed once. She sold that first harvest not through a tasting room or wine club, but directly to winemakers, sending samples to a handful of contacts from her consulting years, people who understood exactly what old vine, dry-farmed fruit actually meant. The response came faster than she expected. A well-regarded winemaker 2 counties over, tasting her fruit's concentration for the first time, offered a contract price nearly 40% above standard county averages for Zinfandel, specifically citing the vine's age and dry-farmed character in his offer letter. Grant Whitfield heard about the contract before summer was out, the way news traveled through that valley, and he drove out to Del Carmen that August, standing at the edge of the property looking at rows that had, 6 months earlier, looked like exactly the abandoned mess everyone assumed they were. "Heard you signed with Callahan, 40% over county average." "That's right," Nora said. He was quiet a moment, looking at the vines. Doyle really did run this place into the ground. He ran his business into the ground. The ground itself never had a single thing wrong with it, just took somebody willing to look at the vines instead of the bank statement. He didn't have much to say to that. 2 months later, Grant's own wine manager mentioned in passing that Grant had started asking around about whether any other foreclosed properties in the county might have similarly overlooked old vine blocks nobody had properly evaluated before writing them off. By the following spring, Nora had signed contracts with 3 separate winemakers, converted the old tasting room into simple functional equipment storage rather than reopening it, and kept Hector on full-time, finally paid properly for work he'd been doing without pay for the better part of a year before she ever bought the place. He still walked those rows most mornings, the same way he had through 3 previous owners, telling anyone who asked that Nora Alvarez had understood something the whole county missed at that foreclosure sale, that a business failing and land being worthless were never actually the same thing at all, and that 18 acres nobody wanted for $40,000 had turned out to be one of the smartest purchases anybody in that valley had made in years.